Around 10 years ago, I recorded a video that is titled Some Advice About Becoming a Philosophy Professor, and it was responding to a student's query about, I want to become a philosophy professor, what's involved in that? And it's drawn a little over 50,000 views in those 10 years, a lot of comments, a lot of discussion. And it's come up every once in a while as people make new comments, and I'm like, I probably should update this video. And that's what I'm doing here. But I'm actually going to do a set because I ranged across a number of topics, and there's a lot of things that people have asked about. So I am going to here just reapproach this question of what does it take to become a philosophy professor? What would I be getting myself in for? What are my prospects? And I'm going to talk about some of the other topics, like should I major in philosophy, which, is a separate question from should I become a philosophy professor? Obviously, if you want to become a philosophy professor, majoring in philosophy or some other related field is probably going to be very important, but it's not quite the same thing. So I'm going to do some other videos on other related, connected topics that were brought up in that original one. So let's start with this one. I do want to make a few provisos right off the bat. I understand the American setting much better than I understand how it would be, in even Canada, let alone Europe or other places. So what I'm saying here might apply as well to, Great Britain or Canada, but there's no guarantee. I'm going to be talking primarily about what goes into becoming a professor here in the United States. Everything that I have to say here is, like Aristotle says about ethics, for the most part. There will be exceptions. Every single thing that's complicated in human life does have those. I'm not claiming to know everything about this. And this brings me to the third proviso. This is going to be based on my own experience and what I've heard from my friends and colleagues and even people who I don't particularly know or care for, but who have something interesting to say about it. But the picture is going to be partial. So once again, there'll be exceptions, there'll be blind spots, but I can tell you my own reflections and what it is that other people have to say about the matter. The second thing that I want to say before we jump into the nitty-gritty of this is that I think that, and this is, going from some of the comments that I've had over the years, it's really, really important to be realistic about this sort of thing. Not unduly optimistic, pie in the sky, I'll be the exception to the difficulties, not unduly pessimistic, it's all terrible, it's all crap. Somewhere in the middle. We want to look at the available information that we have. We want to think about this in non-hyperbolic ways. And we should be realistic about ourselves as well and our prospects for finding the kind of work that, would be the ideal of being a philosophy professor. And I would say one needs to be philosophical about this prospect of teaching philosophy full-time in a professorial setting, as well as the other alternatives to that, the things that are along the same lines but not paid quite so well or protected or any of those sorts of matters. There's a lot of people I've also noticed who have some fairly well worked out, rather rigid projections and plans for themselves. They're saying, I'm going to do this. What will that automatically lead to? I should make this decision rather than this one. And I do want to say there's no guarantees when it comes to this sort of matter. We don't know what things are going to be like 10 years down the line. If current trends continue, it's probably not going to be very good. But, again, we don't really know. We're not fortune tellers. So we do want to realize how much of this is up to chance and luck and coincidence and how much of it is up to a rather unfairly skewed system and how vastly different things can play out from year to year and from job search to job search and candidate to candidate. So all of that said, let's jump in now. What's actually required to become a philosophy professor? Well, you do have to get hired for the job, but that comes at the end of a lot of other stuff. First, you probably are going to get yourself a BA in philosophy. You might, double major. You might be in a PPE, philosophy, politics, economics program. There might be other ways in which you go, but generally you got to do something as an undergraduate student that involves studying philosophy. And there's lots and lots of places, lots and lots of programs where you can do that. Some of them are very prestigious, but may not actually be all that good, or they could be quite good, but not the right fit for you, right? There's all sorts of factors involved. And then after you get your bachelor's, then you go on and you either go straight into a PhD program, which, personally I typically advise against because I kind of think you're missing out on some stuff by doing that. Or, more traditionally, you get your master's degree, 2 more years of investment there, and then you go on to do your doctoral work to earn your PhD. And at the master's level, you will most likely be expected to write a master's thesis. You might have to take some comprehensive exams, although those are often going away these days. And then at the PhD, you would, continue doing some coursework and eventually propose and then write and then defend a book, a dissertation of your own, which is the product of research. And, that generally takes people 3 to 5 years. Sometimes it takes them longer. There isn't a simple recipe for it. Some people take a little bit longer with their master's degrees as well. But you can expect, 4 years of bachelor's, 2 years of master's, and then probably say an average of 4 years at the PhD. So you're talking about a 10-year investment to be possible as a candidate for the jobs that are out there to get hired to be a philosophy professor, to teach philosophy and do all the other things that a professor does as well. In addition to getting your degree, you probably would be expected also to have some publications in peer-reviewed journals. Book chapters sometimes count, though a little bit less. You're probably not going to have a whole book out there necessarily, although a lot of people do turn their dissertations into their first book. Teaching experience is also quite important. You want to start teaching, or at the very least, being a teacher's assistant for some other professor who's teaching classes while you are a graduate student. You probably want to do some various service work as well, because down the line, that's part of what they're going to expect you to do as a professor. And, very important is actually networking with other people. You do this by going to conferences, by presenting papers, commenting on papers, by reaching out to people, participating in all sorts of, face-to-face and online venues and organizations and projects and stuff like that. Now, I do want to say that you've got to be very careful about taking advice from people who've been successful in this and think that their recipe for success will automatically work for you. This is a very big problem for my generation of students because the previous generation of professors really had very little clue about what the job market had turned into by the time that I was going out in 2002 onto the job market. And, so were my peers. There's lots of different stories. There's lots of different circumstances, and what worked in different times may not actually work for you. Let's talk now about the prospects for finding a tenure track teaching position, being a professor of philosophy. What are the odds? They're not great. When I first entered graduate school in 1995, they gave us a document that said, we just want you to know only 2 out of 3 of the PhDs in the past, in recent years, ever found full-time work. Now, that doesn't mean tenured. That means including part-time, postdoc, all of that sort of stuff. Only 2 out of 3 are going to be successful with that. So it's gotten much worse in recent years. So just as an example, the Daily News has articles on this every year. So in the most recent Daily News article, they talk about the NSF survey of earned doctorates. And in 2021, there were 399 new PhDs in philosophy. So that's a lot of people, right? How many jobs were there for them in the next year that we can look at? I mean, we're going to talk about 2022 to 2023 because that's even better than 2021 to 2022. So there are 372 total jobs advertised in jobs, in filled jobs, right? Now, there may have been a couple outliers that weren't advertised there, that were advertised in other places, but there's less jobs than there are new PhDs on the market. And you got to remember all the other PhDs who came out in recent years, they're also mostly still looking for work. And then there's people who actually have positions. It might be a tenure track position, or it might be a, adjuncting or full-time but only limited contract or a postdoctoral thing. They're all looking for jobs too. Plus you got older scholars who maybe want to try to use getting a job offer as a way of getting a raise at their institution, often one of the only ways you can get a raise, right? Or they just want to trade up. There's also people who get out and they kind of try to move up the rank. So there's a lot of people out there chasing those 372 total jobs. Not all of those jobs are tenure track, meaning where you can get tenure. Of those 372 total jobs, 94 of them were simply postdoc positions, postdoctoral, where you're at a place for, maybe a year, maybe 3 years. You settle in, you do some work there. Maybe you do some teaching, maybe you don't. Another 121 of them were what we call fixed term positions, which might be, again, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. They could be renewable, but they're not tenure track. I worked a job sort of like that when I first got out of graduate school myself, when I was working for Ball State in their prison education program. I was not eligible for tenure, and I was not eligible for promotion because I was working for extended education. As a matter of fact, my chair said, "Oh, I'm really so sorry about this, because given the work that you're doing in publication, you would be an associate professor." This is 3 years in, but that's just not possible. So a lot of these jobs are not tenure track jobs. Now, I had some interesting things that people said as comments that I wanted to bring up. The most recent was by the 11th doctor 6 days ago. He said, "I know this video was made a long time ago, but I'm considering majoring in philosophy as I have exceedingly good reading and writing skills. I'm just not sure if 12 more years of school is worth the chance of teaching philosophy." Now, 10 years is probably the average, right? But you can understand that sentiment. There was another person about a year ago who thought I was being far too pessimistic, who said, this is Sumi Cray, "Whenever I see at several universities, there are so many lecturers, professors, and they're specialized at this and that. I just think that they're also human beings like me. If they can do it, why can't I?" And we'll get to that in a bit. There isn't anything saying that you can't get a job. It's just kind of difficult. Robert, 6 years ago, said, "As someone who's been dreaming throughout college to be a philosophy professor, I'm starting to see the reality of the field, and honestly, it doesn't seem appealing. Grinding for years to get a degree with not even a 50% conversion job rate, and not even being especially well paid if it does work out, makes the field much less attractive." That's understandable. And 2 years ago, Stephanie Spivak Fox said, "I abandoned being a philosophy professor despite support from all my professors because the job market scares the shit out of me. I hope again that I don't have to settle." So a lot of interesting points of view, right? So let's talk about the job market. We use this term market as if there's actually some rational, vast buying and selling going on. But it's not quite like that. It's actually, a lot of people will say it's much more like a lottery, but it's a crooked lottery. It's not a fair lottery. And there's a lot of things to it, that many, many factors that you just can't control and oftentimes can't even really know. Much of the job, lottery is luck in various ways. There was a great discussion about that on Twitter a while back that I actually did a video about, which I'll link to below that you can check out. It's arbitrary. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. Pedigree plays a role, meaning where did you go to school, your prestige in various sorts, where you're currently teaching, the connections that you have. And it's not a meritocracy in any respect, right? And there's all sorts of other things. You might say kind of facetiously, it certainly doesn't hurt to be independently wealthy if you want to stay on the market or come from a wealthy family, or also to be not a first-generation academic, to have a family who themselves are professors. As a matter of fact, when we look at the stats on this sort of thing, as people have been doing lately, what we do find is that there are incredible advantages to quite a few people that the rest of us don't necessarily enjoy or are even aware of. And I'm going to read some things about what happens in the whole job interviewing process. And this comes from Paul Schofield. He wrote a very interesting Twitter thread a while back where he said, "Academic job seekers often think because they didn't get a job one year or didn't get a particular job, there's something they should change in their application. That's often a mistake. Here's some reasons maybe you didn't get the job that are beyond your control." So here's the first one. The ad is written with a specific candidate in mind who the department intends to hire. That candidate is not you. Very often the fix is in from the very beginning. This happens all the time, and you never know it until you get tipped off in some way. Number two, the ad lists an area of specialization the department has decided it's not going to hire in, either because listing it was a ploy to get the line approved, or the department changed their mind once they looked at the applicant pool. This is your area of specialization. You never had a chance. Number three, you get eliminated in the first round for a job you're qualified for because the initial screening is given to one or two people who are overworked and trying to be aggressive when whittling down the pool. You disappear and are forgotten after 2 minutes. So many job pools consist of anywhere from 200 to 1,000 candidates. One of the main jobs of the selection or hiring committees is to get rid of as many applications as they can right at the start. Number four, the department thinks you're too much like or not enough like the other members of the department. Both of these can be reasons for throwing off a candidate, and you never know which it is when you send an application off. Number five, there's another candidate in the market exactly like you, and departments are picking between you and that person, perhaps arbitrarily, perhaps on the basis of some leg up that person has. You're otherwise perfect, but this person's existence ruins your year or career. Number six, everyone loves you, except one member of the committee, and as unfair as maybe that person is being, it's easier to find a candidate that everyone likes than it is to fight with one's colleague. Nothing you could have done would have changed this person's mind. Number seven, someone on the committee speculates on the basis of little or no evidence that you won't stay if you're hired. Your attempts to signal otherwise are taken as defensiveness about this, making your professed desire to stay all the more reason to treat you as a flight risk. Number eight, the committee doesn't think your work needs to improve. They hate what you're doing. So attempts to make it better, to clarify it, just make them angrier and more likely to throw out your application. It's not the quality of the work they hate, it's the work. Number nine, the committee illegally discriminates against you. that sort of stuff does happen. I've seen hiring committees where that happens. Number 10, you've published too much or too little. Both are reasons for rejecting a candidate. By publishing more and making yourself more attractive to some, you make yourself less desirable to others. 11, a committee member totally misreads your application and eliminates you. No one protests because they all want to go to lunch. You receive the rejection and you assume it's because Professor X disagreed with the footnote on page 27 of your writing sample, when really it has nothing to do with that. Finally, number 12, a member on the committee has a preferred candidate and it's not you. You are serious competition though, so the committee member tries to take you out early. Others see what's going on but don't want to fight with his colleague and again want to go out to lunch. Now these are just 12 possible ways in which things can and often do go wrong in the hiring selection. So just be aware that there's a lot of caprice, a lot of chance, a lot of, randomness even, or, things going wrong that are quite possible, even if you are a great candidate, even if you've done everything that you're supposed to do. And so here's another interesting topic. This actually comes from a piece called The Cruelty of the Adjunct System by Alexander Bradner. It's depressing to be on the market year after year, and there could be all sorts of emotions involved as well. Now, Bradner is talking about what it's like to be non-tenure track faculty, and her piece says, that beyond regret, sorrow, anxiety, and fear, non-tenure track faculty live with toxic feelings of failure. Now, notice she's not just talking about adjuncts, she's actually talking about other people who just don't have tenure track positions but are being hired year to year. What else do they feel? Anger at all sorts of things, their profession, their colleagues, guilt, gratitude, love, pride. And then one of the lines she says is, but mostly there's overwhelming sadness. Does this have to be the case? No, not necessarily. But it is a challenge, an emotional challenge that you do want to be quite aware of. The American Philosophical Association has a very long and detailed guide for philosophy job seekers, and they talk about applying for the 5 basic kinds of academic positions at elite private and flagship state universities, positions at regional comprehensives, what they call second-tier public institutions, positions at liberal arts colleges, positions at 2-year colleges, and online positions. What they're leaving out there, of course, is adjunct work, right? What does it mean to be an adjunct? So to be an adjunct is to be somebody who is hired term to term. You don't have the expectation in any sort of contract of continuing employment. You are hired per class. And, in some cases, adjuncts may be paid quite well per class, at some institutions that treat their adjuncts pretty decently. I've seen adjuncts paid as much as $6,000 or $7,000 per class, but that's the high end. You can also find cases where they're paid as low as $1,600 per class to teach an entire semester, and then everything in between. It varies from region to region and institution to institution. There is no one single rate out there. There is an interesting, a lot of self-reported data because adjuncts have been filling out these spreadsheets where you can find out what they're actually earning. And odds are you're more likely to adjunct throughout your career than you are to get a tenure track job as a professor who has job security and decent pay and all the other things that go along with it. And, to adjunct year after year after year really tends to burn people out. If it's your sole source of income, it really sucks because you have to cobble together effectively a career for yourself, going from school to school to school, none of which really care about you as a person. Even your colleagues may steal classes from you. I've had that happen to me as an adjunct where I developed a class and then my colleague was like, I think I'll take that over. And yeah, that's pretty common, right? Or you may get hired one semester, then not get hired back and not even know why, right? So there's a lot that you have to think about with that. Even if you're not an adjunct, but you have a full-time position, but it's not tenure track, so you can't be guaranteed of being there, it can still be quite difficult. Jeremy Davis has a great piece called My 5 Years on the Philosophy Job Market, where it does have a happy ending. He gets a tenure track job eventually, right? But he says this: moving around for years, living in relative financial precarity, constantly having to do confusing and time-consuming administrative paperwork in new places, finding new doctors, paying first last month rent before receiving the return deposit from your previous apartment, wondering if you'll ever be able to find longer-term stability in a place, losing and making new friends, generally just uprooting your entire life and that of your spouse, partner, family. These are unfortunately pretty standard occupational hazards in the field, and this does take a toll on people. I had a colleague when I was at Fayetteville State who had had 7 jobs in 9 years, moving from place to place to place, all the way across the United States, almost every year, but sometimes having a reprieve, not having to move until the next year. And it just burnt her out. You know, by the time that she got her tenure track job, we got hired at the same time at Fayetteville State University as new assistant professors on the tenure track. She just, was worn out from all of that stress. So again, I'm not trying to dissuade anybody. If you really, really want to try to be a professor, it is possible, but it's difficult quite often to get into those positions. Most likely you're going to get adjunct or part-time, or full-time, but without job security kind of work. But you could think about, what if you do happen to get it? What if you land a tenure track job? Well, what is the life of a philosophy professor like? We imagine it as, being surrounded by books and having these colleagues that we get to talk to and wonderful conversations and students who are paying attention all the time and challenging us and, moving from virtue to virtue, as they say, writing our books, writing our articles, doing all the things that are so important to the life of the mind. And yeah, you get to do that some of the time. I mean, I've had a tenure track job. You also do lots and lots of other stuff, lots of committee meetings. You may be advising students. You have to, do not just writing your own stuff, but also be willing to review other people's things. And you could expect that probably not a great number of people are going to be looking at, reading, getting excited about your work. Probably the students that you're teaching will be an interesting mix. Now, I certainly myself, I've had a great time with my students from the beginning all the way up to this year. I've been teaching for 22 or 23 years at this point, quite a while. And, I like teaching people who are not philosophy majors because I think that's a great way to have connection between philosophy and the rest of the world. But that can be tough for a lot of people who are teaching and would really love for students to be a bit more engaged, impressed, even interested in the vast world of philosophy. And you just can't take that for granted even in elite institutions, because quite a few of those elite institutions, some of the students are there just as legacies, or, their parents made donations, or they're there, on this scholarship and that scholarship, and they don't care about your philosophy class, which is just something to get through. If you happen to be lucky enough to teach graduate students are pretty easy to teach because they're self-motivated, right? It's tougher to teach the students who aren't quite sure why they're taking a philosophy class. And, as a professor, you have teaching, which is a very important part of the job. You have, doing your research, and then you have service. You have to do all sorts of other things as well. We can also say that on the whole, salaries for professors are, new hires are kind of declining. They're not getting paid quite what they were back in the past. It's very interesting at some of the places that I teach where you can see the vast disparity between those who were hired 20 years ago and those who are being hired right now. It's not even close to comparable. But this depends from institution to institution, right? Some institutions have the money, the budgets to pay very well and do so. Some of them do have the money to do that and then don't. They may have a significant endowment, but they treat their new hires, and not just professors, but staff, quite poorly. We can also talk about two big issues that are essentially political issues: academic freedom and tenure. Now, in most places, academic freedom is pretty well respected as a general principle. And there's fewer and fewer tenure track jobs, more and more adjunct work and, renewable contracts than actual tenured stuff. But there are still quite a few places where that exists, but it's often being threatened. In the case of tenure, sometimes it's political, and sometimes it's just that the administrators would like to get rid of it so that they can turn the workforce into a much more dependent workforce that they can hire and fire at will. In the case of academic freedom, we're seeing that there are states where conservatives are particularly targeting the state university systems, telling professors what they can and can't teach, right? So this is a significant issue, and it's probably going to continue on. So I want to finish this up by saying, I've thrown a lot of information at you, and it may sound pretty doom and gloom, but again, I think it's very important to be realistic. If you want to try to be a philosophy professor, there's nothing that will stop you from, say, going and majoring in philosophy and then, perhaps going on to graduate school. But there's no guarantee that you're going to get that job at the end either. There wasn't a guarantee even for my generation coming out over 20 years ago. There's even less guarantee in the present were you to begin today and 10 years down the line, with your PhD in hand, start applying for jobs. It is possible. Anything is possible, but it is tricky. And so, if you really want to do this, you should think about it. There's other possibilities. There's many things you can do with philosophy. I'll talk about those in other videos. You don't necessarily have to go to university to study philosophy. Being a professor is not the only thing that you have to shoot for, but it is something that I think a lot of people interested in philosophy have as an ideal for themselves. And so I just wanted to, give an update and my thoughts and those of others that are, I would say, fairly well within the consensus of the discipline about all of these matters. And hopefully this gives you some food for thought. It doesn't just bring you down, but, tempers any sort of pie-in-the-sky idealism that you might have towards something a bit more realistic in orientation.